Good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Maryland panel. I'm Matt Destler, many years a professor, now emeritus at the School of Public Policy at Maryland and a specialist in American policymaking. I want to tell the audience and the panel that we are recording this event, and so you need to be aware of that. I hope that is fine with you all. When I asked Bill Galston, a longtime colleague at Maryland before he went to Brookings, to join us once again on the post-election panel we've been holding every 2 years, and we've been using the title, What Happened and Why? Bill suggested that we should change the title to What is Happening? Wisely, we did change the title, and that proved obviously to be prophetic. As we all know, this morning, a big thing happened. Biden moved ahead in Pennsylvania with every prospect that that lead would grow. Therefore, and this means he would bring the challenger, the vice president, to the magic number of 270 electoral votes. There's even a distinct possibility of him winning 4 out of the 5 undeclared states, which would put him over 306. However, overall, I think the Chinese curse still applies to this event. May you live in interesting times. Or if you've been glued to CNN the last 2 or 3 days, Groundhog Day is relevant, with the same numbers appearing on screen hour after hour, same day after day, same commentary from same weary journalists. That pattern seems to be beginning to break. But it has been a remarkable, crazy election with the Trump-Biden contrast on clear display yesterday afternoon. To help us understand this, we have a fine expert panel. Jeremy Rosner will begin. He is managing partner at Greenberg Quinlan Rosner, a Washington-based polling and strategy firm. He has been involved in US politics and foreign policy in several presidential campaigns and worked in the Clinton White House. Stella Rouse will follow. She is Associate Professor of Government and Politics at the Maryland School of at the Maryland Department of Government and Politics and Director of its Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement. She is the author of, among other works, The Politics of Millennial. Batting cleanup will be Bill Galston, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at Brookings, and my colleague for 2 decades at the Maryland School of Public Policy. He has published widely on political theory, American politics, and public policy. He writes a column for the Wall Street Journal and was Deputy Assistant to Domestic Policy in the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. So without further ado, let's move to the panel and ask Jeremy to talk.
Thanks so much, Mac. It's great to be with all of you. It's obviously disappointing that we can't be together in person as we have been in previous years, but it's great that you're able to keep this tradition going, and it's just great to be. Mac has ticked off what, for those of us who are Democrats, is today's steady march of good news. But despite that, I come here in a pretty dark mood. Not as dark as 4 years ago when we did this, and I, like many Democrats, was shell-shocked that morning, that Wednesday morning, but certainly darker than 2 years ago. And for sure, despite the good news, which seems to be propelling Joe Biden to break 270 electoral votes, I'm not at all certain that we are past the dangers of Trump and his supporters trying to block these results. And if there's one thing that 2020 has taught us, it's that the unexpected will happen. And nobody could watch Trump's statement yesterday without being reminded in the worst ways that he will go to absolutely any lengths to hold on to power. So we may yet get a Goldwater moment like in 1974 when party elders go to him and say, Mr. President, it's over. But that certainly hasn't happened yet. And indeed, many, many Republicans either remain shamefully silent in the face of the president's incendiary remarks or are actually echoing them like House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Moreover, even if Joe Biden becomes the 46th president, we will still be living amid the wreckage of a process of polarization that's happened for a half century or so that's left our country increasingly torn and ungovernable. We've seen nearly all of our major institutions fall terribly short over the past 4 years. And we now have 70 million some people nearly who voted for more of that, for continuity of that. And that divide will hobble our country, I fear, as we try to deal with COVID and other big challenges that require cooperation and compromise. But let me put that dark preface aside and take a minute just to analyze the results. And let me address 3 big points. First, let me note what I see as the most important dynamics that help explain the 2020 outcome. Let's start with turnout, obviously an enormous story, the highest in 120 years, probably 67%. I think it's especially impressive in the face of the pandemic. Other countries have had elections during this period since March 11th and when the pandemic started. And there have been 14 major elections around the world. On average, turnout has declined in more of them, in a majority of them, by an average of about 3 points. There have been a couple countries that took extraordinary steps to protect voters' health, like South Korea and New Zealand, and they saw some improvements in turnout. And South Korea actually had the highest turnout in 28 years, but ours is the highest in 120 years. It's a tremendous testament to our democratic institutions at the state level, the new procedures for voting by mail and voting early. And one of Trump's huge mistakes in all this was to denigrate voting by mail, because ultimately of the 150, 60 million votes, about 100 million were early, about 2/3 of those were by mail. And the exit polls suggest he's losing those votes, those early mail votes, by a 2-to-1 margin. And our polling early on picked up that by denigrating mail-in voting, he was scaring away a lot of his voters from the safest way for them to vote. The second thing is Trump himself. Every US presidential re-election race is ultimately a referendum on the incumbent. This was that completely. From the very first days we started doing research in preparation for this race, which was early 2017, it was clear that the whole story was going to be Trump, that people either loved him or hated him. And that was true through the 2018 midterms and through the primaries. And the big fundamental was that his approval ratings hovered almost every day of his presidency between 40 and 45%. And just, they were incredibly stable compared to other presidents, but they were incredibly low, historically low. And that put a cap on his ability to win this election. Related to that is that he just had a completely flawed strategy that was based on the base, on pumping up his base. From his first day in office, he made really little attempt to broaden his support. And ultimately, his strategy on re-election proved to be about as bad as his strategy on COVID. He seemed to lack any ability to be nimble, to adapt, to learn, to respond to new data about what was happening in the electorate. And so, going into this race, it was clear what he was doing. He was juicing up his electorate, juicing up his base, white, working class, rural, evangelical. And, he did a pretty good job of it. In lots of places, his vote did increase, and turnout on their side increased as well as on our side. But it fell short ultimately. And I think it was doomed from the start, in that it was, there's only so much you can juice up your base in ways that are going to offend the rest of the electorate. So in some places, his margin with his base actually fell, places like Lackawanna County in Pennsylvania, where he significantly upped Mitt Romney's margin from 2012 from 36 to 47%, but it fell back down in this race to 45%. Or in Wisconsin, he increased his vote level across the whole wide range of counties. There were 23 counties in that state that Obama had won, but then Trump won, and he improved on average across those counties, but not enough. And he lost, I think, 4 of them. And the gains from Democrats in the urban areas like Milwaukee and Dane County, Madison, were just so much bigger that his ability to win by juicing up his base just fell short and was doomed. On the other side, Democrats did a really good job of both expanding their electorate and turning out their base. It's really notable that when you look at African-American voters, an incredibly important part of the party's base, Biden is likely to not only improve on Hillary's somewhat disappointing showing with African-American voters in key locations, but even exceed Barack Obama's vote totals in places like Philadelphia and maybe statewide in Georgia. I think the Democratic Party did a lot to invest in voter lists, to adapt its field techniques online to deal with COVID, and did a pretty good job in turning out its base in the places it need to. I think another huge story is the center in this. You know, there was a big argument, and there will continue to be, between the wings of our party, which is always going on. And there was an argument on whether a more liberal candidate could have done better to motivate the party and win this election. But if you look at the numbers from the exit polls, and you know, I don't completely trust the exit polls the way I used to for various reasons, but if we look at the average of the 2 main exit polls from Edison and AP, they cast doubt on the notion that, that the salvation was going to be with a more progressive candidate or a younger candidate. And they show that actually that the victory here came from the middle. If you look at 18 to 29-year-olds, the vote share that they gave Democrats was up 5 points, but their share of the electorate actually declined. They were not driving this. It was actually the elderly who both shot up as a percentage of the electorate and shifted away from Trump. They didn't shift all the way to Democrats as it appeared they might do earlier in the race, but they shifted significantly away from Trump. The gain in the vote was mostly from, you know, not the non-white rising electorate, but from whites, and especially white men, where they, you know, white men went from a minus 32-point margin in 2016 to a minus 18-point margin. It's the biggest demographic shift. Most important was the ideological shift. You know, it didn't come from Democrats turning out in bigger numbers. It came from, or from liberals turning out in big numbers. It came from moderates. Moderates went from going +6 for Democrats to +31 points. Huge, huge shift. Same for independents. We lost independents by 6 points in 2016. We won them by 14 points this time. Democratic, self-identified Democratic and Republican partisans barely moved. And, you know, I think part of what became clear in the painful call that House Democrats had yesterday is that, in fact, some of the progressive language made it more difficult for the endangered Democrats, many of whom lost seats in the House, surprisingly, that they were swimming against the tide of ideas like defunding the police that made it difficult for them. I think, you know, some of the new progressive leaders like AOC have contributed a tremendous amount of energy and have a great future, but it's hard to argue that we would have done better with a more progressive candidate rather than Joe Biden. I think another thing that's worth noting is there was a real change on disinformation. Our firm helped run the biggest program in the country on monitoring and combating disinformation. You know, Democrats were caught flat-footed on that in 2016. This year, there was a huge coordinated effort, and it made some gains in making sure we were aware of the incredible coordinated effort that was going on the Republican side with networks like Sinclair Broadcasting, Salem Media, and the State Policy Network, and made some progress with the platforms, getting them to shut down things like Steve Bannon today, or the Stop the Steal Facebook page, which tried to echo Trump's notions about the election being defrauded, but was pulled down. Why wasn't there a full blue wave? I think in a lot of places where some Democrats had their hopes up that were pretty Republican, those Republican voters at the end of the day just went home to their natural home, places like Texas and South Carolina. I think there was also a bit of a fading fatigue with COVID. I think around July and August, concern about COVID had really pushed a lot of Americans away from Trump. I think by the end, some of that had faded. There was something really interesting in the exit polls. The AP exit poll asked what was the main issue facing the country. If you ask it that way, it came back with COVID at 41%. The Edison exit poll asked it a little bit differently. They said, what was the issue that mattered most to your vote? There, COVID came in at number 3 at only 17%, behind the economy and behind race. Now, Biden did better on, who would do a better job on COVID and the pandemic by about 8 points, but it wasn't a landslide. And I ultimately think it didn't end up being as dominant for a lot of people like elderly voters as it early on seemed to be. Going forward, just a few words. I think, if Democrats don't take the Senate, not much is going to get done, especially on domestic policy. In past years, we've talked about the dangers of overreach. I think there won't be much danger of overreach. There'll be a danger of underreach. But the impact will still be huge. Obviously, on foreign policy, where the president has almost unlimited ability, you're going to have a 180-degree turn back to more traditional foreign policy, being close to the EU, NATO, advocating for democracy, human rights, climate change. I think we'll have more of a normal Department of Justice, and adherence to the rule of law. And a lot can be done, obviously, on labor and environment and safety, DACA and things like that by executive order. There will be a continuing question about, I think, what to do about law breaking and rule breaking under the Trump administration, and how much Democrats and Department of Justice should go after that. There will be an argument that only banana republics do that kind of thing. On the other side, there will be an argument that we have to have accountability. Mostly, I think we're going to have a set of dueling narratives, and we'll see those on display in what appear to be these 2 Georgia Senate runoffs. On one hand, you will have the Democrats saying, we have all sorts of wonderful things that we're ready to do and that have passed the Democratic House, to expand healthcare, to make progress on climate change, to address income and wealth inequality. But they're being held up by Mitch McConnell and the extremist ideological special interests that back him. And on the other side, you'll have Mitch McConnell and the Republicans saying, we're all ready to compromise and do great things. But unfortunately, Joe Biden is hostage to crazy Chuck Schumer and crazy Nancy Pelosi and Bernie Sanders and AOC and the socialists and the squad. And you can't afford to give in to those people or you wreck America. I think that will be the argument on display in the Georgia special elections, which will be very close and interesting. And if Democrats don't pick up the seats to control the Senate, that'll be the ongoing narrative debate going forward to 2022. I'll just close very briefly with a word about the polling. I woke up on Wednesday to notes from all my friends who are no longer friends now, with the headings on the email saying must really suck to be a pollster this morning. So of course I have the role of addressing that. I think, as in 2016, the overall national polls won't be so far off. We may have a margin of, Nate Silver says 4 to 6%. The averages were 7 or 8% in the polls. And many of the polls were accurate. We did 5, our firm were the pollsters for 5 of the top Senate races for Democrats. We said, we told our clients all 5 would win. All 5 of them did win. And in all but one of them, the polling was spot on. So it's a mistake to say that polling is dead or fatally flawed. But there were obviously huge places where the polling fell short, especially in the Midwest and Florida. And I think there are two kinds of errors, and it's important to distinguish them. First is the error that people speculate about shy Trump voters who get on the phone with a pollster and then lie about who they're planning to support. I think some of that may be possible, but I think it's much less the problem. And if Trump voters were shy in 2016, they sure haven't been shy lately. You know, they seem to have no shyness, especially, you know, this gets down to notions of social desirability of their answer. They live in a filter bubble where supporting Trump is the socially acceptable thing. So I think that's less of an issue. We will for sure do a lot of experiments with things like indirect questions to see if it makes a difference, rather than asking who do you plan to vote for, doing things like who do your neighbors plan to vote for. But I don't think that's the biggest issue. I think the bigger issue, which is actually more troubling, is what we would call non-response bias. That the people you manage to get on the phone, which has been steadily declining and is now down, you know, low single digits, 5% often, are, you know, were not as representative of the whole population and the non-respondents as they were in the past. And it could be, you know, I think it's very interesting that we're seeing this in places like with Trump, but also with Brexit. These are elections that drew in people who had not been part of the political process before. And it may be that people who are not normally part of the political process also are less willing to take polls. And so, you know, we have to do a lot of work on that. We may need to present polls in the future with different results for different kinds of assumptions about the model of the electorate that will turn out, which is one of the things we're less good at predicting. We're good at predicting how people will vote, but not who will vote. That said, polling, you know, everyone will continue to poll in terms of candidates. It continues to be the best way to figure out where a race is and what messages work. But we obviously have to fix a lot of problems. So I will stop there and eager to hear my co-panelists.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. You've given us quite a lot to think about. Stella?
Thank you, Mac. Yeah, that's a really great overview and a tough act to follow. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the youth vote and you know, hopefully complement and maybe in a little way contrast what Jeremy said. See if I can share my screen here. Maybe. Give me 1 second. Not showing up for some reason here. Let me see. Try this one more time. Here we go. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about young generations, their identity, and then what I'm seeing in the data that I'm looking at in terms of their participation in the 2020 election. And I just want to start by talking a little bit about the identity of young people and what the perception is versus the reality. So we've heard a lot about millennial stereotypes and young people stereotypes. You know, certain things that have been said about them. You know, your avocado toast addiction is costing you your house, with a reference to the fact that millennials don't do a good job of saving their money and sort of frivolously spend it on things like avocado toast. That they're lazy and entitled, that they're self-absorbed, have been some of the media references to them. And really what I would say about millennials and Generation Z as well is that, you know, I don't think these stereotypes are true from the research that I have done. And hopefully my talk here today and what I present dispels some of these stereotypes. What we do know as one stereotype that has traditionally held true is that young people tend to vote at lower rates than older adults. And it's the reason why oftentimes politicians and political parties don't target young people because they know they historically are not going to turn out in elections. And young people oftentimes don't turn out in elections because they don't think that politicians and parties will represent their interests. And so there's this sort of perhaps fatalistic cycle that is at play here, at least traditionally, that has kept young people from actually turning out to vote. And there's a lot of reasons for that I could spend, hours talking about. But what I do want to say is that, hopefully, perhaps there's a light of hope that trend is changing, and I'll present some results, some data at the end that hopefully indicates that. But before I get to that, I do want to kind of provide a basic definition when we talk about young people and the two youngest generations, which are millennials and Generation Z. And millennials are those that were born between 1981 and 1996. And we think about them as those who experienced some part of their formative years around the turn of the century. And Generation Z are those that were born after 96 that are fully digital natives, whereas millennials are mostly digital natives, but older millennials do remember perhaps what a rotary dial phone looks like. I'm not sure, maybe they might remember that. And Generation Z has spent their entire lives really with the United States fighting the war on terror, this a never-ending war that has helped inform, I think, their attitudes about foreign policy to some extent. So just some basic sort of characteristics, but one that's really, really important about both generations is their diversity. So millennials are the most diverse adult generation in US history, and Generation Z, once they are all adults, will certainly take that mantle away from millennials. And we can see these changes in this graph here in terms of the changing dynamic of the country as far as diversity. And I think that says a lot to the election of 2020 and elections moving forward. And I will talk a little bit more about that at the end. We also know that both generations are much more liberal than older generations. And many of you might say, well, young people are generally more liberal and then they get more conservative as they get older. But what we're finding in the data is that, at least for millennials, that liberalness really seems to be persisting as they age. And you can see that from this graph that Pew put together. They've been tracking millennials since 2004. And we can see that the consistently and mostly liberal is staying relatively high compared to Generation X, boomers, and the silent generation. So that trend of getting more conservative as they get older, at least in early data, seems to be breaking, and that liberalness is persisting. As I've already mentioned, being digital natives is a huge sort of characteristic of both millennials and Generation Z, and how quickly they are able to communicate, communication at the touch of their fingers instantaneously, and that really allows them to communicate not only with people in their own city and state, but around the world, which is really important in the way that it informs their ideas about government, about policy, about taking care of the world. And then, of course, we know that the Great Recession had a significant impact on millennials, and the pandemic recession that we're going through now happened for millennials, sort of the 2008 recession when they were entering the workforce. And now at the height of when they should be having their most earning potential, they are suffering from the pandemic recession. And Generation Z is in the same place that millennials were in 2008. So we still don't know what exactly the effects of the pandemic recession are going to be for both generations, but they are certainly going to have an effect. And then another important defining characteristics is that both millennials and Generation Z have a tremendous distrust for institutions. They are more likely to call themselves independents rather than, align with a political party, even though I've already mentioned that they're very liberal and progressive, and obviously the Democratic Party platform and what the party stands for is much more aligned with young people, but they are less likely to really identify as either Democrats or Republicans. And as I already hinted at, this digital nativeness of them and their ability to sort of communicate with people around the world informs what we call their cosmopolitan identity, which millennials see themselves much more than older generations as citizens of the world, and have this collectivist worldview where they believe that society as a whole is more important generally to individual interest, and it's the responsibility of everyone to sort of uplift society. And so those things are important to keep in mind as we talk about what issues and what is important to millennials. And we can see here that the comparison between Generation Z and millennials is not very different, and they are, both of those generations are different in their attitudes about certain issues relative to Gen X, boomers, and silence. When it comes to diversity, race, the role of government, as I already mentioned, cosmopolitan identity, social issues, and the environment. So we know that young people vote at consistently lower rates than the rest of the population, and we see that trend going all the way to 2016 here in this graph. But one question that we address in the book and that we continue to address is whether millennials really are politically disengaged. And our conclusion is that, yes, if you look only at voting, right, and perhaps that's even changing as well, given what we've seen in 2018 and 2020, but the characterization is really missing nuances that don't look at less conventional measures of participation. And we distinguish between what we call duty-based citizenship, which is where voting falls in, along with campaign contributions and things like that, and what we talk about in terms of engaged citizenship, which is more direct individual actions, volunteering, marching, and protest. And we have really seen that this year and in years past with the Women's March, the Climate March, the March for Our Lives, and certainly the marches we've seen, the Black Lives Matter marches that we've seen this year. And you can see that this holds true when you compare other forms of participation. Millennials are right there with older adults. They only lag behind when we talk about voting in registration, voting in the last 4 years, and an intention to vote in the next presidential election. So to close this off, I want to talk a little bit about the midterm elections and then what we're seeing in the 2020 elections and what this means, what these generations mean moving forward in American politics. And we did see an increase, certainly among youth turnout in 2018, a significant increase, quite honestly, from what we had seen in other midterm elections. And so that was very promising coming into 2020 that young people would continue that trend of voting at higher rates. And the reason for that is, or the potential for that really is not the reason, but the potential is that millennials and Generation Z have really pretty much overtaken baby boomers in terms of being the largest generations and cohort of voters or potential voters in the electorate, right? Millennials almost matched or are right there with baby boomers, and Generation Z is certainly increasing as many of those reach the age of 18 and the voting age to vote. So they're a very potent group, young people are, in terms of their numbers. And we do see that has certainly paid off in terms of increases from 2016 to 2020. These are some early numbers, early voting numbers for those among age 18 to 29. And you can see the difference relative to 2016 in terms of early voting in some important states. You can also see the percent that each candidate got with some of the trends that we're seeing. So for example, in Arizona, 60% of the youth vote, 18-29, voted for Donald Trump. For Joe Biden, compared to 36% for Donald Trump. And it shows you here on the right-hand side, the percent of the youth share of all votes in that state. And so, even though perhaps that young people were a lower share of the voting electorate, as Jeremy indicated with some of the exit polling, which I also think is should be taken with a grain of salt. I think there was an increase in the voting electorate overall. So relative to older adults, that may be the case, but in absolute terms, I think that young people did show up at greater numbers to vote. And that may have had certainly an effect on some of the elections in these close states. I want to talk about Latino youth for just a second. I know that there's a lot of interest in what happened in Florida, and I'm happy to answer some questions about that in the Q&A. And certainly Florida and perhaps Texas got some media coverage because it showed that Trump made inroads, particularly with Cuban Americans in Florida, and that certainly propelled him to win the state of Florida. We know that some of the early numbers that we're getting is not so much true for young Latinos, and even Cuban young Latinos who were more likely, at least a percentage of them, to support Joe Biden and Donald Trump, relative to older Cuban Americans who were more likely to support Donald Trump. And overall, across the country, Latino youth and young people overall were overwhelmingly supportive of Joe Biden. And so just to finish off here, 1 or 2 slides left, I thought this was interesting to look at if we looked at what if only young people voted in the 2020 election. And we can see that this map looks very different than the typical maps that we see representing the total electorate in terms of blue and red. And certainly given where young people lean and what their policy preferences are, the map would certainly look very different if we only looked at young people voting. And then I want to finish off by just showing you, as we progress into the future, that demographics isn't destiny for sure, and that a lot of things can happen, but certainly as a percentage of the voting electorate, millennials, Gen Z, and whatever generation comes next are going to gradually become the major players in American politics, at least in terms of numbers and hopefully in terms of voters. And what that means for the way the two parties sort of address the issues that they care about and whether they can court those voters moving forward. At this point, the Republicans really have a lot of work to do with young people, denying climate change and not doing anything about climate change, better addressing gun control, better addressing healthcare are really issues that young people care about. And as they become a greater part of the electorate and they put a lot more pressure on politicians, it will be very interesting to see how both parties address these issues and whether Republicans can really court young people into that party in ways that have not been shown over the last several election cycles. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure some of those issues are going to come up during the question and answer period. And now, batting cleanup for us is Bill Galston.
Well, it's great to be back as a panelist on Mac Destler's long-running hit series of post-election panels. I want to begin my comments by praising one panelist and complaining about the other one. Stella, when I was at the University of Maryland, one of the things that I'm proudest of 20 years ago was founding a research center on the political beliefs and behavior of young Americans. That center still exists, although it's now moved to Tufts University. And I'm delighted to see that you and other scholars are still carrying the torch for young Americans and understanding how they think about politics and how they participate in it. Now for my complaints. Jeremy, as you delivered your remarks, I kept on taking my pen and crossing out things that I'd intended to say because our minds moved in eerily consistent tracks. I had hoped that I was the only one who noticed that difference between the two exit poll questions, but I didn't get that lucky. But that's what happens when you go up against a pro. So my remarks are going to be substantially shorter than the ones I planned. And so I'll spend the rest of my time complaining about you. Let me now make an historical point before coming to the present. I think it is conventional wisdom and correct conventional wisdom that as a nation, we've been deeply divided for a long time. And this election, if anything, deepened our divisions or revealed the fact that they have deepened. But there's another significant fact which, combined with the deep division, accounts for the governance problems that we've experienced in recent decades. We are not only deeply divided, we are also closely divided. And let me give you a piece of data on that score. The election just ended was the 9th consecutive presidential election without a landslide winner. That is, someone who wins the election by 10 percentage points or more. There is no precedent for such an extended period of relatively narrow victories in the history of the United States. In the post-Civil War period, you only had 5 such elections of that sort before the realigning election of 1896. So if it feels as though we're stuck, it's because we're stuck, right? We have 2 great massed armies of Americans who've been waging political war across roughly the same front line now since the early 1990s. And until that changes, or until the 2 political parties learn how to function as cooperative competitors rather than uncooperative competitors, we'll continue to have a hard time governing ourselves. As you noted, Jeremy, this was a record turnout. And I think it's important to note that we really don't know the final results. We're not close to knowing the final results. As things now stand, I estimate there are 16 million votes left to be counted. Back of the envelope calculation suggests that when the dust settles, Joe Biden will have a victory margin of about 4 percentage points. I don't see how it gets to 6. I disagree with Nate Silver on that point. And a popular vote margin of about 6 million, in both cases about double Hillary Clinton's performance. It's not a landslide, it's not close, but it's not a squeaker either. And people who panicked on election night forgot about the distinctive characteristics and patterns of voting in this year as opposed to all other years. So what can we take away from these results? First of all, they reveal some structural changes in the Electoral College. Let me just list 3, or 2 change and 1 endorsement of the status quo. On the Republican side, I think there's now pretty compelling evidence that Ohio, Iowa, and Florida should no longer be regarded as pure swing states, but states where the default setting is a Republican victory. The presumption is against Democrats, and they'll have to work very hard to overcome that presumption if they want to win those states again. On the other side, it turns out that the rumors of Democratic competitiveness in important portions of both the South and Southwest were not exaggerated. I don't think that Biden is going to win North Carolina, but he's going to get awfully close. I do think he's likely to win both Georgia and Arizona. You put those 3 states together with 15, 16, and 11 electoral votes combined, and you have a pretty significant shift in the center of gravity. And now for the status quo, Democrats' hopes ran high for the state of Texas, much too high. I never believed it, having spent 10 years in Texas. I couldn't believe it had changed that much. And sure enough, it hasn't. And Texas is still some cycles away from being truly competitive. On the demographic side, and maybe Stella can backfill me on this point, I think the following truism has been reinforced. The term Latino is a census category that does not denote a group with a single unifying experience along the lines of African Americans. You can create a continuum of Latino votes, of Latino groups, depending in part on nations of origin. And clearly, if you're a refugee from a socialist paradise, you are not likely to vote Democratic, at least not this year, and and vice versa. I think the election revealed that the contemporary Democratic Party is perfectly capable of expanding its appeal to white Americans. Overall, Joe Biden improved the Democrat share of white votes by 5 percentage points, if you believe the exit polls, which I choose to do right now for want of anything better. And as Jeremy pointed out, it improved its standing among white men by 9 full percentage points, 31% in 2016, 40% in 2020. That's a big change. And it raises some very interesting questions about the real sources of white male opposition to and distaste for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. But I'm about to plunge into very deep waters, so I think I will pull back. And even in the heart of the Trump coalition, non-college educated white men, Joe Biden was able to raise the Democratic share by 6 points, from 29 to 35%. By contrast, Donald Trump actually did slightly better among African Americans and Latinos than he did 4 years ago. This was supposed to be the year of the woman, and the truth turned out to be exactly the reverse. Biden made no advances among women relative to Hillary Clinton, but very significant advances among men. If I recall correctly, from 41 to 48%. Again, a 7-point jump. That's really significant. And as Donald Trump correctly claimed, as it turned out, he would have a special appeal to African American and Latino men. There was a very large gender gap among both African Americans and Latinos, a smaller gender gap among white Americans. And once again, it's interesting to speculate about that differential appeal across gender lines, or between the genders, for Donald Trump in the major minority communities in the United States. And as Jeremy pointed out, the gains ideologically were all in the center. To put it simply, Joe Biden did the job that he was chosen to do. And I have to say, I am increasingly skeptical that any candidate other than Joe Biden could have done that job in the special circumstances of 2020. I'd add that this election confirmed my longstanding view that Donald Trump didn't win the election in 2016 so much as Hillary Clinton lost it. What do I mean by that? Well, simple. In 2016, there were 54% of the Americans who did not want Donald Trump to be their president. But Hillary Clinton only got 48 of those 54 points. That's why she lost. The rest dribbled off to third-party and independent candidates. In 2020, 53% of Americans didn't want Donald Trump to be reelected president, and Joe Biden was able to mobilize almost all of them. And that was the difference. Not that there was a huge shift in American attitudes towards Donald Trump. There was a huge shift in American attitudes towards the alternative to Donald Trump. And that turned out to be crucial. 2 final points, and I'm done. There was a comprehensive Democratic failure at every level except the presidential level. That includes not only the House, where the Democrats lost and as yet undetermined but non-trivial number of seats. It includes the Senate, where Chuck Schumer had very high hopes of being the next Senate Majority Leader, and he must be the most disappointed man in Washington right now, with the possible exception of the president, although I'm not sure Mr. Trump in his heart of hearts really thought that he was going to win re-election. But that's not a job for political analysts to determine, but rather psychoanalysts. Now, what does this mean? Well, first of all, and nobody else has made this point, so I will, Democrats didn't manage to flip a single legislative chamber in the states, which means that Republicans will control the redistricting process in 2021 in the same way that they did in 2011. And so Democratic hopes of undoing Republican gerrymanders 10 years ago are now defunct. And talking about defunct, the entire progressive legislative agenda will be stalled in Congress for the foreseeable future. It has no prospects of being enacted into law. And the interesting question is how both the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the President of the United States are going to react to that uncomfortable reality. Which brings me to my final point about Democrats and the political situation we face. The single most important relationship in Washington over the next 2 years and maybe the next 4 years will be the relationship between the president-elect of the United States and the presumptive Senate Majority Leader. Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden have a long history of doing business. They even managed to do business during the Obama administration. In fact, on more than one occasion, Senator McConnell sent a plaintive plea to the White House, please send me Biden, right? Because we can sit down and break this logjam, otherwise we're stuck. I am hopeful, cautiously optimistic, that at least some of that working relationship can be preserved early in the Biden administration, and that if President Biden chooses to lead, either with issues that must be addressed, like COVID-19, or issues that can be addressed, such as police reform and how to crystallize the new bipartisan consensus on the threat posed by China into workable public policy, both domestic and foreign, that we might have a not totally conflictual first 6 months of the Biden administration. But many things can go wrong. Finally, implications for the Republican Party. This was a repudiation of Trump, but not of Trumpism. As a matter of fact, if I were Donald Trump, I would feel really terrible, even worse than he feels, because it's clear that this is a repudiation of him as a person, but not of the Republican Party that has reshaped itself around his distinctive political orientation. So the new Trump coalition, which is built on voters from small towns and rural areas, non-college whites, evangelical Protestants, and conservative Catholics, that is the center of the Republican coalition for the foreseeable future. The business community is beginning to fragment and move in the other direction. Many moderate Republicans have, in effect, left the Republican Party. No fewer than 8 former Republican governors ended up endorsing Joe Biden for re-election this year. That is a phenomenal number, and it bespeaks to the sense that those sorts of Republicans, from one side of the country to the other, by the way, including Mark Rasko from Montana, former chair of the Republican National Committee. That tells you something. And Republicans from virtually every Midwestern state, as well as Christine Todd Whitman from New Jersey. So it is pretty much a coast-to-coast moderate Republican rejection of Trump and Trumpism. So, so what we're going to see from the Republican Party, and this is the best we have to hope for, is what I'll call Trumpism with a human face. People, people who can carry forward a populist-leaning agenda without the nasty overtones of, racism and nativism and xenophobia. Now, what is the likely consequence of this? Well, it may offer some new grounds, ironically, for bipartisan cooperation. I would point out in conclusion that the very same Florida electorate that gave Donald Trump a large victory by Florida standards also voted by 61% to raise the minimum wage in Florida to $15 an hour. It wasn't as though a different electorate showed up to vote on the proposition about the minimum wage. These were the same people. And if you think of it, from the standpoint of the working class, you can imagine how voters on the one hand would respond favorably to Trumpism when it comes to trade and immigration and a number of other issues, including cultural issues, while at the same time believing that on meat and potatoes economic issues like the minimum wage, that the more progressive take on the issue was in fact the one that was most consistent with their interests. So it will be different. It won't be dull. Buckle up your seatbelts.
Thank you very much, Bill. As usual, you've given us a lot to think about. I want to make a couple of comments in a few minutes. And before we turn to let me make one comment, but not ask panelists to respond unless they would. Except at the end of Bill's comment, it is striking how little of the conversation was about Donald Trump in terms of what he influenced, who he pulled, who he didn't do, how he affected the process. Now, obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about him in the coming days as the drama of getting him to withdraw presumably plays out. But still, he obviously colored the last 4 years much more than most presidents in terms of the prominence of what he said, good or crazy. And I think this is going to be a question he might not, Bill Galston's Trumpism without Trump may be the future. After all, Trump isn't a young man, but it may be not the next 12 months, because is he going to fade away, or is he going to continue to use Twitter to his following and throw monkey wrenches in various ways? Or will the lack of the presidency platform mean that it'll be increasingly laughed at or disregarded? But a longtime colleague, Chris Foreman, has joined us, as he retired 1 year after I did, and he is here to raise a question or two. Chris?
Yes, thanks, Mac. I'm just going to take 2 minutes and rattle off a number of points in no particular order in response to what's been evolving and in response to some of the things that have been said. First of all, the whole point that Bill Galston makes about the combination of polarization and parity between the parties is absolutely spot on. As I recall, Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein have been making that point for a while. I also think that his point about Biden having been exactly the right and maybe the only candidate who could have pulled this off is absolutely correct. We can all remember back when people were very dubious about Biden for all sorts of reasons we don't have to go into, but he actually, I think, showed that he was exactly what he said he was, and what we sort of people who were for him thought he was. He's a lot like the slightly older version of guys I went to grammar school and high school with. I was in Catholic school for 12 years and in Baltimore, and 8 years with the Sisters of Charity and 4 years with the Jesuits. He's a lot like the older version of those guys. And so I'm not surprised that he appealed exactly where he turned out to have been appealing. I think the biggest thing he's going to be able to do perhaps is rebuild the administrative state, which has been damaged undoubtedly. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but that's one thing he will have, along with the ability to have some running room in foreign policy and international affairs, to be able to take that on, restoring morale to inside the civil service, the top layers of the deep state, okay? I wonder whether infrastructure might be a possible place where some actual policy could get made. I originally thought Trump would take that on, that would be a natural place for him to take some action, but then of course he drifted off and became a kind of default, kind of standard issue default Republican in many policy ways, as you know, with tax cuts and deregulation and so on. I don't think Biden needs to appoint any Republicans to his cabinet to reach out. Maybe he will, but I don't think he needs to do that. I know there are progressives who are horrified at the idea. Whether he does or doesn't, I don't think it matters that much, but I don't think he does. I think you may see, I think the DACA folks should be happy. I wonder about whether, as a big thing, I don't know, Social Security and Medicare reform could be possible. This is the situation that is supposed to be, both parties each have to take some blame, take some share of the responsibility. Is that possible? I don't know. I just leave that out there. I guess where I'll end is where the former Romney campaign advisor, Stuart Stevens, ended up with his book, It Was All a Lie, which is the idea that that long run, the Republican Party is kind of demographically doomed to sort of, to sort of shrivel as an all-white party. I wonder what people think of that. I wonder what Stella thinks of that, and what the other panelists might think of that. But that's about all. I think that's enough of a cacophony of things for me to inject right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Let me raise a broader question and see if the panelists have any thought on this. Suppose that Biden, being a sort of a left centrist, decides he really wants to do something dramatic to break partisan gridlock. What steps could he take that signal strength and not weakness? I mean, does he meet Mitch during the first week after this election? Does he, contrary to what Chris Foreman does he appoint some prominent Republican, but one who has not just a John Kasich, but somebody who has credibility with the Republican Party? What could the president do, if anything, to put himself in an interesting position of saying, I'm welcoming bipartisan support and cooperation, but I'm not a weak guy. I'm not in a cave. If you guys won't take my hand, there are other things I can do as president. They may not involve legislation, et cetera. So I wonder what the president, if the president were so inclined, as I suspect he would be, to reaching across and doing some bipartisan coalitions. I mean, infrastructure is always talked about. The only problem is he's not going to talk about probably closing the budget deficit in the short run, as long as the economy is in the current shape. I'm skeptical about Medicare and Social Security. I think the Democrats are too attached to those as sledgehammer, as cudgel things to beat the Republicans with, that they'd be willing at this point to move. Anyway, the floor is open. Let me raise one question that was sent in early. Basically, people who asked about Latinos and young voters, which Stella spent a fair amount of time on. But I wonder, and I'm still not entirely persuaded about why it seems that the pollsters, the experts got it wrong, at least in terms of Texas, maybe in terms of Florida, though the Cubans are always a special thing, in terms of the degree to which they would be part of an anti-Trump or pro-Biden coalition. So let me raise both of those questions and see any thoughts from members of the panel. The question of what Biden might do to promote bipartisanship without appearing to be weak right at the beginning, and the question of why did the Democrats not do better with Latinos?
Well,
Bill?
since I was the first to unmute, let me respond very quickly in a cursory manner to all of the questions that have been put on the table in the past 5 minutes. For taking through Chris Foreman's point first, rebuilding the administrative state up to a point, certainly with appointments. On the other hand, the newly conservatized federal judiciary may have something to say about that, and get ready for an all-out assault on the non-delegation doctrine. It's not clear to me that the basic legal architecture of the administrative state that we've lived under for decades is going to survive a Biden administration, not because of anything he did. Infrastructure, yeah, if they can agree on how to pay for it, which has always been the sticking point. Everybody wants roads and bridges and universal broadband access. Now show me the money. I have to believe that President Biden would take a run at that question as a part of an economic revitalization program that might have appeal across party lines, but they're going to have to figure out more creative financing. What the Trump administration put on the table was farcical. The assumption was that most of the money would come from the states and the private sector, and the feds would only supply 10 or 20% of it. Doesn't work that way, except on projects where some private company anticipates a tolling bonanza. And many of them have been very disappointed when they've gone that route, by the way. DACA, yeah, I think there could be an agreement on DACA if a President Biden were willing to decouple it from broader comprehensive immigration reform, a step that Democrats have been unwilling to take for quite some time because they viewed it as the locomotive that would pull the rest of the immigration reform train. But that hasn't panned out too well, even though I personally believe that not only a majority, but a supermajority for comprehensive immigration reform has existed for more than a decade. But that's a rant that I get on if you give me a chance, so I'm not going there. Entitlement reform, absolutely not. And not only for the reason that Mac put on the table, but also a newly populist Republican Party doesn't want to go there either.
Yeah.
Paul Ryan and Ryanism are dead in the Republican.
No Pete Peterson's left either.
Right. You can forget about that. We're in a new world now where both political parties are going to have to figure out how to pay for these programs because they're not going to cut them. Demographic determinism, I don't believe it. And here's why, and Stella can jump in to contradict me afterwards. I think Latinos are embarked on the same road that older generations of immigrants from places that the native stock population wasn't familiar with previously will travel. I think in 2 generations, they will blend into the rest of the non-Black population. As you know, there was a book written on how Hungarians and Slavs and Italians became white. I happen to believe that Latinos are a pretty good candidate to be the Italians of the 21st century for all sorts of reasons, including a family orientation, entrepreneurship, cultural conservatism among Catholics and especially Hispanic evangelicals. So I think that counting them as part of a rising American electorate, the famous RAE, or assuming that the template that applies to African Americans applies to them is a fundamental analytical mistake. I do not believe it. As for a dramatic break that President Biden could take, the only way bipartisanship is real is if compromise is significant. And we'll get an early test of that with the COVID-19 bill, which everybody understands has to be at the front burner of the agenda. What will the Republicans be willing to give up, assuming that President Biden is willing to give up something? In my view, in order to get agreement, he's going to have to give up on the entire sort of social program portion of the HEROES bill and focus on the basics. And I suspect that the bipartisan compromise bill that's been floated in both the House and the Senate, in the range of $1.5 to $1.8 billion, focusing on the basics, will turn out to be the point of equipoise, if there is one. And if we can't even agree on that, then we won't be able to agree on anything else, in my opinion.
Thank you, Bill. Any other comments on?
Well, I would just say that I'm a little less sanguine than Bill is about the chances for the Biden-McConnell relationship to produce results. I always felt that, Barack Obama was unfairly characterized as being bad at that kind of arm twisting and backslapping. He wasn't great at it, but I don't think it made so much difference. And I think people overestimate what Biden can do with it. I think the problem is structural, that Republicans and Democrats don't have much incentive to compromise. And so you can blame it on lots of things, but I think ultimately there won't be much room. I think there will be a stimulus bill before the end of the year, in part because there has to be. But I think beyond that, it's slim pickings. Now, you could try to take the approach, if you want to do something really grand, like President Peña Nieto did in Mexico, of trying to have a pact with the opposition parties around a program, almost in a parliamentary sense, where you get advance agreement that when you get in, you're all going to do this together. I think, that's not out of the question. It's almost out of the question, though. And there's so many structural reasons why that's almost impossible to do in our system. We don't have, our leaders don't have the same control over their parties that they do in Mexico, or certainly in parliamentary systems. So I think it's pretty tough. I think, I really think that the story of the next 2 years, assuming, by the way, that the Senate is out of reach, which it probably is, but I think that door is not shut yet, and we should, wait for these Georgia special elections. But assuming that the Senate is out of reach, I think we're in for a very deadlocked period. I think, one thing we didn't get to that we would have been talking a lot about had the Senate gone Democratic is, if that were to happen, should or could the Democrats dispense with the filibuster, add DC to get 2 more senators, pack the court and things like that. Those are moot questions now. But I think, they could become live again. Obviously, if Georgia has an unlikely double Democratic victory, or, in the next 2 to 4 years, if there's a further shift in the Senate.
You're assuming, Jeremy, that all of the Democrats in the Senate would vote to abolish the legislative filibuster. I have pretty good reason to believe that that's not true.
So I think that's right, and many of them declared against it. But I think it depends what was pending. If something as dire as the stimulus bill needed to get through, that could change. But I think for sure, a bunch of them, some of them have declared against it.
Can I jump in and address the Latino issue? I know there's questions
Please.
in the chat about that, and I wanted to address that a little bit. So I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. First of all, a lot of the media coverage on the Cuban Latinos in Florida was compared to Hillary Clinton. We need to keep in mind that Latinos have historically voted Republican in elections. So going back to many elections, you know, Cuban Americans were a solid voting bloc for Republicans. They went much less for Trump in 2016. Hillary Clinton made inroads into that group. But as we're seeing now, they're to some extent returning back to their partisanship. And Donald Trump made a lot of effort in Florida and in Miami-Dade County. Right after his 26th election, he started to mobilize that group for his reelection, much more so than the Democrats did, much more so than Joe Biden did. So it's really not a surprise, given the historical leanings of Cuban Americans, how they voted in this election, coupled with the Trump and the Republican effort to mobilize that group. Now, keep in mind that mobilization was based on a lot of misinformation that was going on in the Cuban American community and the Latino community in Florida. You know, the label of Joe Biden is a socialist, and this will become a socialist country if you elect him, really stuck with many Latinos, particularly Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans, Colombian Americans, Peruvian Americans, as well as other misinformation that, you know, the kids in cages was a lie perpetrated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There was a whole host of misinformation. And I think the Democrats are really going to have to figure out how they combat that. I'm not sure that's going away with Donald Trump. It's more of a characteristic of Trumpism. Now, perhaps another person can't pull it off as well as he does in terms of a singular individual, but certainly that is a tactic that has worked for Republicans in the Republican Party. The other thing, and I think the more interesting thing is not so much the Cuban Americans, although they're getting a lot of attention, it's the fact that Donald Trump won 48% of other Latinos in Florida as well, and that includes Venezuelans, Colombians, and so on and so forth. So that to me perhaps is more concerning moving forward in the Latino community in Florida. But something to keep in mind in terms of what really worked to mobilize those folks in favor of Trump. But overall, right, so this picture of focusing on Florida, you know, is important, and I think that needs to be dissected and you know, addressed. But overall, as I said in my presentation, Joe Biden won the Latino vote, if we're going to classify him as a Latino vote, as a Latino umbrella. But Bill Galston is so correct and very wise in saying that is a total misnomer. Latinos are not monolithic. They come from different places with different experiences, and they have priorities on different issues. And I think that has also been a problem of the political parties, is trying to address them, as Bill said, with a census label, which is Hispanic, but they also don't necessarily ascribe to the Latino label. They don't even ascribe to the Latina X label, which is something that has been going around. Only 3% of Latinos even, you know, utilize that label or see themselves under that label. They're much more likely to identify themselves with pan-ethnicity identity, which is, you know, Colombian Americans, Cuban Americans, Bolivian Americans, right? So they have that attachment to their country of origin. And I think political parties need to do a better job of addressing that issues to matter to those particular communities and disaggregating the Latino label. And I do want to address what Bill said about, you know, that he believes moving forward that Latinos will blend in and look more like, you know, Hungarian immigrants or Italian immigrants of the past. I don't really believe that, or at least I don't see any evidence of that to this point. There are a lot of differences between the way that Latinos have been treated in this country and the history of the way that they've been treated relative to those immigrants. There's a lot of shade of color among the Latino community that I think will prevent that sort of, you know, elevation to whiteness, so to speak, that will put them on a level playing field. And I don't think their interests necessarily will completely align, at least not in the short term, with raising them to that level. the other issue that I think agree a little bit with Bill on, that I think remains to be seen, is that he's right about the fact that third and fourth and fifth generation Latinos, and even now, Latinos are much more native born than they are foreign born. And so they're American citizens. And as we get further into the generations, they will have less of an identity with a foreign country, perhaps even with a foreign language as Spanish, if that is not continued in their household. And certainly they will be, in some sense, perhaps more acculturated or assimilated into American culture. But the issues that matter to them, may or may not change. And I think it really remains to be seen how that plays out moving forward.
Very interesting, Stella. Let me raise a question that's kind of implicit in some of the questions raised before the forum and some being raised during. Let me give you a prelude. In 2012, Nate Silver made himself famous by calling all 50 states in his forecast. Now, Mac Destler, who is not famous for this, called 49 states, missing only Florida. So why such a high score? Well, it was relying on basically on state polls, the average of state polls as presented to us conveniently in the poll in the 538 website, et cetera. Now, that obviously changed in 2016. It changed in 2020. And in both cases, there were, the errors were tended to be, and maybe more this time, in direction of exaggerating the Democratic candidates' prospects and underestimating Donald Trump's. How do we explain this? Is there some pollster methodology? Is there some way to address this in the future? Brief, if you have anybody, I'm happy to leave this hanging if we want to have other questions. It's not, maybe we don't have too much time. Jeremy, you're sort of looking like you.
I'll just say a brief word on it. As I said, polls are pretty good at predicting how people will vote. They're pretty bad often at predicting who will vote. And I think that's especially a challenge during a period, if you look at the difference between 2016 and 2020, you had some more than 20 million Americans enter the electorate. And predicting who's going to do that is very hard, and polls don't provide great guidance on that. And so, that's a challenge at a time when the electorate is changing, when you have a politician like Donald Trump who may have been especially skilled at drawing people into the electorate, either as his followers or as his haters. I think the other thing that's worth keeping in mind is, this is not to deflect the need within my profession for some self-examination, but a lot of the state polls, a lot of where the district level and state level polls get in trouble is when people try to poll on the cheap, either by doing, samples of 300 or 400, or by doing cheap methodologies like interactive voice recognition. And, when we work, for example, with the campaign committees of the party, this is a constant tension. They want to preserve all their money for ads and spend little on polls. And we end up often doing a lot of, because of the budget dictates, we're given 400 sample polls that have, we can see them in the polls that we do for our clients who are, a campaign, a senatorial campaign, where they are gold standard, multimodal polls, 1,000 sample, the accuracy is just night and day. And so I think you have a little bit that you get what you pay for in a lot of these. And I think those two factors explain a lot of the problems we're seeing in some of these state level polls, as well as the problem of, I think, a creeping non-response bias that didn't used to exist.
I don't mean to pile on Jeremy's profession, but I do want to raise an issue with what he just said, mainly because I'm interested in how he will respond to this. I am particularly struck by the fact that many of the gold standard state polls, the ones conducted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, missed badly. particularly in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin and Michigan, but also in Ohio and Iowa and Texas. And so when I look at the gap between the gold standard averages of polling in those 5 not insignificant states and what actually happened, I wonder whether it's just a question of cheap methodologies or whether something more fundamental is going on. Your response, sir?
So I agree. I mean, and I said before, I think the upper Midwest and Florida are particularly troubling, and that there are issues of who voted and who was drawn into the electorate, and whether the kinds of people who are drawn into the electorate may be people who don't answer polls as much, who don't participate in polls as much, and the non-response bias. So that I think there are some of those issues there. And you're right, some of the gold standard polls were off on that. There was a very deep examination of the problems of the polling in 2016 done by the American Association of Public Opinion Research that quite thorough. I'm sure there's going to be another such examination this year. We don't have nearly enough of the results and even the guts of the polls that were done to understand how they weighted and what they assumed about the electorates and what they were modeling. But that's going to be a really important examination and why it was centered in those places.
Thank you, Jeremy. We are winding toward the end of their available time, and apparently there is a serious barrier to continuing past 1:30. So let me basically wind up here by thanking my panel for a very interesting discussion. And I'm sorry we did not get to more questions. I think that has been perhaps a flaw of me as chairman, not figuring out how to integrate more of the questions, many of which were very interesting. And I apologize to the questioners, but I think the whole effort to look at the broader society as well as the specific poll numbers, or specific voting numbers, I should say, was very illuminating. And I've certainly learned a number of things that I wouldn't have thought of before 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time this afternoon. So thank you all for engaging. Thank you for the audience. Thank you for the panel for participating. Thank you for the University of Maryland School of Public Policy for continuing to support this enterprise that Jeremy and Bill and I have been involved in for, I think, at least 20 years. Thank you very much.